The lost colony of Roanoke. In the summer of 1590, a small English ship approached the coast of North Carolina. Aboard was John White, a man returning home after 3 years away. He carried with him letters from Queen Elizabeth, supplies for his settlement, and something far more precious: the desperate hope of reunion with his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia, and the 115 other colonists he had left behind in this New World wilderness. What he found instead would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. The word Suroetoen, carved into a wooden post, was all that remained. No bodies, no graves, no signs of siege or struggle, just those 8 letters and the absence of 117 people who had simply vanished. More than 4 centuries later, we still don't know what happened to them. The story begins not with mystery, but with ambition. In the 1580s, England was a kingdom desperate to prove itself. Spain controlled the seas. Spain controlled the wealth pouring in from the New World. And England, relatively late to the game of empire, watched with growing resentment as Spanish galleons laden with gold sailed past its shores. There had to be something here, some passage to riches, some foothold in this vast unknown continent. There had to be. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier, soldier, and patron of exploration. Raleigh possessed the patronage of Queen Elizabeth and the vision to imagine English settlement across the Atlantic. In 1584, he dispatched 2 ships under the command of Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow to scout the coast of what is now North Carolina. What they returned with was not gold, there was none, but something equally intoxicating: promise. The natives, they reported, were welcoming. The soil was fertile. The waters teemed with fish. Here was a paradise waiting to be claimed, a place they would name Virginia, in honor of their virgin queen. For Raleigh, this was everything. He could not go himself. His favor at court was too valuable, but he could organize, finance, and dream. And dream he did. The first expedition arrived in 1585. About 108 men, mostly soldiers and adventurers, established themselves on Roanoke Island, a narrow barrier island off the coast. There was no family structure here, no women, no intention to build a permanent society. This was a military outpost, a place to plant a flag and search for silver. The men were restless. The local Powhatan peoples, initially curious, grew wary of these strange newcomers. Supplies ran short. Morale crumbled. Within a year, every one of them was gone, evacuated by Sir Francis Drake when he happened to pass by with a naval fleet. Raleigh's grand vision had collapsed almost before it began. But he would not be deterred. In 1587, a second expedition set sail. This time, Raleigh's vision had evolved. He sent not soldiers, but settlers. He sent families. He sent women and children. He appointed John White, an accomplished artist and navigator, as governor of what would be the first English colony in the New World. Among the colonists were White's daughter Eleanor and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, born on the island in August of that year, the first English child born in North America. Her birth was treated as a portent of success, a sign that this venture would endure. The colonists numbered 117. They arrived at Roanoke Island in July, finding the old fort from the previous expedition overgrown and skeletal. There was work to be done. Fort walls to rebuild, shelters to construct, fields to clear for planting. The native peoples watched. Some were curious. Some were hostile. The balance was delicate, fragile, and ultimately unpredictable. By August, it became clear that supplies would not last. The ship that had brought them needed to return to England to fetch more stores. Someone had to go with it, someone to lobby with Raleigh and the Queen to secure funds and provisions. John White, as governor, made the decision to return himself. He promised the colonists he would be back within 2 years. They were uneasy about his departure, but understood the necessity. He assured them before he left that if they needed to relocate, they should carve a cross onto a tree, a signal of distress. Otherwise, they were to leave a message indicating where they had gone. White boarded the ship in the late summer of 1587 and sailed for England. He had no way of knowing he would not return to Roanoke for 3 years.
War intervent.
The Spanish Armada was gathering. Every seaworthy vessel was needed for England's defense. England itself became a fortress, and the colony at Roanoke faded from the list of national priorities. Raleigh, still influential, tried to send relief expeditions, but they either failed to depart or were intercepted by Spanish ships. Time passed in a way that no one had anticipated. What should have been 2 years became 3. When John White finally set foot on Roanoke Island in August of 1590, he was a man in his 60s. He would have been thinking of his daughter Eleanor, whom he had left as a young woman. He would have wondered about Virginia, the grandchild he had barely known. He would have been thinking of his friends, people he had chosen to entrust with his vision. The settlement he found was eerily silent. No smoke rose from the buildings. No voices called out in greeting or alarm. The colonists had dismantled their fort in an orderly fashion, removing the palisade carefully rather than tearing it down in haste. This was not the chaos of an attack. This was deliberate, planned, and then, on one of the posts, the word CROATOAN. Not in a panic, not carved hastily. The letters were neat, methodical. No cross beneath it, not a distress signal. This was a message left by people who had made a choice, who had decided where they were going. But where? The Croton were a local people, living on what is now Hatteras Island. Did the settlers flee to them? Did they marry into the tribe? Did they perish in the attempt? The historical record offers only silence and speculation. White found other clues scattered throughout the settlement. A chest that had apparently been buried and then dug up again, its contents scattered. Maps and documents that had been trampled or water damaged. Some sources suggest that Spanish silver and gold coins were found there, though this detail appears only in second-hand accounts and grows more dubious with each retelling. For centuries, myth has calcified onto the surface of history like barnacle growth on a sunken ship. What White could have told us, what he did record in his journal, is fragmentary and maddeningly incomplete. He seems to have believed that the colonists had moved to the island of Croton. He organized a rescue party to search for them, but a storm damaged his boat and the mission was abandoned. He would never see his daughter or granddaughter again. He would return to England, where he lived out the remainder of his life, possibly harboring the belief that they had survived, possibly tormented by doubt. Within a few years, Raleigh's attention turned elsewhere. The Virginia Company, a joint stock venture that would succeed where Raleigh had failed, was already being organized. New expeditions would be launched. New colonies would be planted at Jamestown and beyond. Roanoke, which had promised so much, sank into obscurity. The fort crumbled into the Atlantic forest. The island itself became something less than a footnote. A mystery, a legend, and eventually a kind of national unsolved crime. What happened to those 117 people? What happened to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in what would become the United States? The theories have accumulated like layers of sediment. Perhaps they were massacred by the Powhatan Confederacy, that vast alliance of native peoples who grew increasingly wary of English encroachment. Perhaps they attempted to sail back to England and were lost at sea. Perhaps they integrated fully into local tribal communities and their descendants walked this land for centuries. Their English blood gradually absorbed into the larger population. Perhaps they were simply swallowed by disease, starvation, and the brutal indifference of a wilderness that had no place for them. The archaeologists have searched. The historians have debated. The word Croton has been examined and re-examined for any hidden meaning. And yet, more than 430 years later, the colony of Roanoke remains, quite literally, lost to history. To understand what might have happened, we must understand the world they stepped into. To understand what might have happened, we must understand the world they stepped into. The Powhatan Confederacy was not a loose collection of scattered tribes, but a sophisticated political network controlling much of the Virginia coast. They had watched the English come and go, had traded with them, fought them, and learned their patterns. Wahunsenkaw, the Powhatan himself, did not regard these foreign settlers as they regarded themselves, as the vanguard of civilization. He saw them as he saw all threats to his dominion, as rivals to be managed, exploited, or eliminated. When John White returned to England in 1587, he left behind not settlers in a land of opportunity, but outnumbered foreigners in enemy territory, dependent on supply ships that would never come. The silence that followed is almost unbearable in its completeness. What strikes historians most is not that the colonists disappeared, but that they seemed to vanish without sending word. No urgent letters were found among salvaged documents. No graves were discovered by later settlers, at least not with English markers. No recognizable artifacts of the fort itself persisted in any reliable archaeological record. It is as though the colony had been methodically erased, whether by hostile forces, by nature itself, or by a deliberate walking away into another life altogether. And yet, traces lingered. Within a generation, stories began to circulate among English settlers arriving in Virginia. Rumors of a fair-skinned child, distinctly English in her features, living among the natives. Whispers that she had been named Pocahontas. Virginia Dare, that singular, symbolic name, seemed to have vanished, but perhaps in the form of another, a child caught between two worlds. Historians dismiss this as folklore, the kind of beautiful narrative that communities construct to make sense of the senseless. Perhaps they are right, but the persistence of such stories, retold for centuries, suggests that something real haunted the collective memory of early colonial Virginia. A girl child, born English in a new land, neither fully lost nor found. The Croton lead, though tantalizing, has yielded nothing conclusive. That word carved into that tree was either a place name, a signal, or perhaps only a word carved into a tree. Archaeological excavations throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have searched Croton Island for remains, for artifacts, for any physical proof that the colonists fled there and were absorbed into the Croton people. Nothing emerged that could be definitively linked to the lost colony. The Croton people themselves left no written records, no oral traditions preserved in colonial documents that might confirm whether John White's hopes were rewarded. What we are left with, ultimately, is absence itself. Roanoke stands as a boundary marker in European American history, the moment before lasting English colonization took hold, before the machinery of empire began in earnest. Every successful English settlement that followed, Jamestown, Plymouth, Boston, was built on the bones of failed attempts and hard-won knowledge purchased by the hunger and suffering of the vanished. When John Smith arrived in Virginia in 1607, 20 years after White's return, the very memory of Roanoke had become a cautionary tale. The lessons had been learned. Come with more people, come with more supplies, come with a willingness to take the land by force rather than negotiate for it. The innocence, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. Virginia Dare would have been nearly 30 years old by that time, had she survived. She would have lived through the transformation of her birthplace from a bold English dream into something far more predatory, far more colonial in its true form. If she lived among the Powhatan, she would have watched as her father's people returned in greater numbers, backed by violence and the relentless machinery of settlement. Perhaps she bore witness to the conflicts that would eventually lead to war, to the slow displacement of peoples who had inhabited this land for millennia. Or perhaps she died young, forgotten, her English name lost to time and the wind. The real legacy of Roanoke is not the mystery of what happened to its people. It is what happened next. The blank space left by their disappearance was filled not with wonder or restraint, but with colonial expansion. Roanoke failed because it was too early, too small, too dependent on resupply lines that could not hold. The settlements that came after succeeded because they were better equipped, better funded, and far less concerned with the people already living here. The vanishing of Roanoke was, in a strange way, the price of the future. Those 117 people, the settlers, the soldiers, and the child named Virginia Dare, may have died or fled or been absorbed, but their colony's failure merely set the stage for the colony that would endure. The forest where Fort Raleigh once stood still exists. Modern archaeologists have identified the probable site. There are museums now, visitor centers, commemorative markers. Tourists walk where once English settlers built earthen ramparts against the dark. The trees are older than any human memory. The sand shifts with the seasons, burying and sometimes revealing. And if you look carefully at old maps, at the historical records, at the patterns of settlement that followed, you can trace a line forward from that word carved in bark to the nation that would emerge on this continent. Virginia Dare vanishes into history not as a solution but as a symbol of all that was lost in the making of America. The stillborn innocence of first contact, the dream of coexistence, the girl-child born between two worlds who could belong to neither. More than 4 centuries have passed. The mystery has never been solved. Perhaps it never will be. And perhaps that unknowing, that stubborn silence, is the truest memorial we could offer those who were lost. They remain unresolved, unarticulated, free from the narrative that history might otherwise impose upon their fate. So tell us in the comments below, which lost civilization would you like us to explore next?